Welcome to the grand finals of the World's Universities Debating Championship 2016. I'd like to congratulate all 4 teams for making it this far, and I'd like to introduce them to you. In opening government, we have Harvard A. In opening opposition, we have Sydney Union B. In closing government, we have PEP A. And in closing opposition, we have Hart House A. My name is Tasneem Ilyas, and I have with me a wonderful panel of Mr. Udayan Mukherjee, Sebastian Templeton, Madeline Schultz, Michael Shapira, Buzz Klinger, Duncan Crowe, Said Sadiq, and Shira Al-Maleh. The motion for tonight's grand final is this House believes that the world's poor would be justified in pursuing complete Marxist revolution. I'd like to start the debate by calling our Prime Minister to deliver their speech. Here you are.
Madam Chair, the global poor, all around the world, and no matter what country in which they live, currently live in a system of dictatorship. They live under a dictatorship known as no alternatives, shackled by capital that's been unjustly acquired, constrained by landed gentry who have no incentives but to pursue their own interests, and chained by the fact that they can't do anything but to look at the question of their own subsistence. They're unable to reach out for the right to liberty and to self-determination that we think inheres in the human condition. How are we going to define a Marxist revolution in this debate? We say that in all its forms, it shares the feature of wanting to break down the system of private property. That's what a Marxist revolution means. It can take place in one of 2 ways. One is it can happen through internal systems that exist presently, that is to say that you vote in Marxist governments who support things like mass redistribution and the abolishment of private property, or it can exist externally in the instance of forcibly bringing down governments that for far too long have tread on these people's rights. The first thing that I'm going to note, just on account of the model, is just a picture of what we think this world looks like. That is to say, we accept that this attempt at revolution won't succeed in all instances, that in many instances it'll just lead to the rise of Marxist parties. But in the world in which we do succeed, we encourage you to use your imagination. That is to say, just notice how chronocentric our vision of civilization is. That is, a system of private property emerged out of the Enlightenment. That is the last 300 years of human existence. Prior to that, people lived in sharing economies where they defined themselves as something greater than their labor and their productive force. That's the kind of world that we support. 2 things, then, I'm going to begin this speech with. First, private property constitutes a fundamental assault in human dignity in 3 key respects. First, it is found and it has been acquired unjustly. In the vast majority of instances, the reason why wealthy countries are wealthy is through processes like colonialism, through slavery, through patriarchy. It represents plunder when you refuse to give any representation or resources to from whom you took money. But even if it wasn't, in those direct instances of theft, in many instances it was negligence. That's to say the creation of vastly constrictive intellectual property rates that means that individuals don't, in the poor, have proper access to things like medication. It's refusal to tax properly. We think negligence is just as morally culpable. The fact that it is unjustly acquired in and of itself gives the poor a claim to that property and to an institution that has itself been harmful. The second thing it enables the poor in terms of a principle is that it allows them to get redress in opposition to centuries of disenfranchisement. That is to say, theft and negligence represent the stripping of the individual right to assert themselves. We're going to give you systematic reasons why you don't get reforms on their side, but notice that this as a principled argument is independent from a consideration of practices. That's to say, compensation or giving more money is unlike categorically what these people require in principle, which is a redress from the fact that they've been taken out of the system of moral equality by theft and negligence. The last thing to say is let's take them at their best. That is, let's wipe the slate clean and accept that everybody has equal access to resources. Why then is property still oppressive, and why does it represent an assault on human dignity? The first reason is that competition and the premises on which it is based is artificial. That's to say it trades on morally insignificant or arbitrary factors. The fact of scarcity, which allows many corporations to succeed. The fact that I was born with certain talents or certain skills that other individuals weren't, we think those are morally arbitrary from the consideration of desert, and we don't think that's just grounds. The second thing is a question of actors. So capital continues to decide what begets it. So you get to decide as the head of a corporation who you hire and what kind of skills you have. Principally, private property assaults dignity. This second leads to good outcomes. Notice what, on the other side, the reason why they need to defend the status quo is that they don't get the levers of structural reforms that you require. There are three reasons for this. The first is the democratic system, that through processes of gerrymandering which are almost irrevocable in very many parts of the world, the poor are systematically disenfranchised. They don't control hegemonic media that control media narratives about what good policy is. They're usually kept apart by racist rhetoric that accentuates other ascriptive descriptions, preventing them from coming forward. The fact of historical disenfranchisement, furthermore, means that they're less likely to turn out the vote in a way that other people are. The second reason why you don't get structural reform is because it's internationally imbalanced on the considerations of nations. So the Bretton Woods institutions largely built by the West, the institution of human rights, which favors civil and political rights over socioeconomic human rights. We say that those things mean that the alternative they need to defend is continued and systematic inaction. What do you get under our side? One, the success cases. These are the ones in which the revolution works. Closing, I'll take you if you have something. Opening.
Despite this rhetoric, the last 2 decades have seen almost 1 billion people lifted out of poverty in Asia because private companies have an incentive to unlock an unskilled and uneducated workforce that they otherwise wouldn't.
We refuse that premise. The reason why we were able to get socioeconomic rights in countries like China is through massive systems of redistribution and bringing up the poor from the public. So if you want to claim literally the communist country for your side, that is to say the people who've put together the single biggest program of economic and social rights, yeah, okay, I think enough said. So let's say the world in which they succeed. We think that those communities will succeed for 3 reasons. First, it encompasses the vast majority of the global population. And given that capital is dependent on labor to get any returns from it, we think that's beneficial. Second is the location of resources in many parts of the developing world means that they have access to those things. The third thing to say is that you get pollination, and you get global solidarity across racial lines, where currently capital has the incentive to get them divided. Those deals with the best case scenario for their side, where you get complete revolution. Spinelli will also talk about why you get structural reforms along the way that are beneficial. What we need from an opposition is a comprehensive account of property, why it's just and why it doesn't, as it has continually done throughout history, assault human dignity. We're very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech, and I'd like to invite our leader of opposition.
Bo wanted to champion China as an example for his side of the house, but the Maoist revolution in China condemned millions and millions of people to famine and poverty. In actuality, if you want to talk about lifting people out of poverty, it's only since China has since started to liberalize and allow a flow of capital into that country that people have lived better lives and will continue to live better lives into the future. We're going to do a number of things. We're firstly going to talk about why opening government can be completely misleading on the scale of what a global pursuit of Marxist revolution looks like. We think Marxist revolution in this context must be violent. Then we're going to look at the circumstances under which we think violence is justified. Thirdly, then, why this would be disastrous for the poor, for in the period preceding this revolution, during the revolution, and after the revolution, even if we assumed the level of success that they wanted to say would come about. So firstly, in rebuttal, why do we think this revolution must be violent? Because Bo presented us with two options for this revolution. So we can use internal structures. He then went on to say about and talk for like minutes in his speech about how the poor are locked out of all of those internal structures, like democracy. His second option, which he wasn't so keen on in talking about through the rest of his speech, was external ones, forcibly removing the structures of power. The forcible removing of those structures that he wanted to talk, that he didn't really want to explain, was a war. Was essentially a war, because that was the only way that you could convince literally millions and millions of people who were privileged by the systems of capital and lived really, really good lives and enjoyed their lives and didn't want to have that capital stripped away from them, to just give it all up and consent to this world where there is literally no conception of private property, which you said is the goal of your revolution. So, where do we think the violence is justified? Firstly, we think that you have to justify it on pragmatic grounds. We think there has to be some expectation of actual liberation in the end, because otherwise you're simply engaging in revolution for the sake of like making yourself feel good. We think that that is akin to a level of sadism. It's like harming others in the hope that like to get some sort of level of pleasure or satisfaction out of that act itself. We don't think that that's good enough. Secondly, we think that the people that you are targeting have to be shown to have a high level of culpability for causing your suffering. Bo wanted to talk about a dictatorship that the world's poor live under. But let's actually look at how that dictatorship works. That's like individual consumers in like capitalized, liberalized societies choosing to spend small portions of their money on certain products, which then directs that money to large TNCs, and then those TNCs engage in oppressive practices on the other side of the world. We don't think that each of those individuals, which are the people that you have to target and the people you are holding responsible, are particularly cognizant of that action or aware of that action to the point where you can hold them to a standard where you can revolt against them. Thirdly, we think that all of the imperative that Bo wanted to set up was not as good, was not as great as he wanted to make out. Because we would tell you in opening opposition that capitalism is working better and better for the poor. We pointed into a point of information to it lifting 1 billion people out of poverty. And we think that's because of the very selfish incentives of capital gains that Bo wanted to decry. Because you want access to more labor markets in the developing world. Because it's economically efficient to tap in to like intelligent and underutilized populations around the world when your own populations have become too educated and too wealthy and have demanded their rights. But on top of that, we think that you don't just have to rely on the systems of capitalism in our world, because democracy and things like collectivization into labor unions become more and more successful, according to an arc or a trajectory. So as those people become marginally wealthier through the flow of capital that the capitalist incentives create, their ability to spend it on things like education and self-empowerment and self-determination improve as well. That's why you get better participation in those internal structures in our world than after you engage in this revolution. So we don't think they meet the standards required for this revolution. But why, even if we let's say that they do when they engage in this revolution, would it be disastrous, particularly for the world's poor? So I want to firstly talk about the period preceding this revolution. Because the premise of any Marxist revolution, whether it be through these internal voting structures that they then said were not open to the world's poor, or through forcible removal of power structures and violence, the premise is total solidarity and as much buy-in as possible, because that's your comparative advantage as the global poor. It is an advantage in numbers. The way that you trigger that buy-in then is by further slips into greater and greater poverty, by making those people's circumstances so much worse and so bad that that is where they are willing to rise up and join in your global revolution. What does that actually look like in the real world? That means undermining things like welfare programs, like foreign aid schemes, like public health insurance. That means you are condemning people now for the sake of some hope of a better future. And the people you condemn are the most vulnerable amongst that movement, because there are relative levels of poverty, and we think that your Marxist revolution and the people who are making those decisions are likely to be the most privileged, the most educated, and the most well-off amongst that group, and the people who they choose to sacrifice in the pursuit of this end are those who are most vulnerable. We don't think that is acceptable whatsoever. Now, why do we think that the Marxist revolution, even once you've reached that unacceptable level of buy-in, is still likely to fail? Because we think that the tools that you need to use and utilize are force and violence. That might have made sense when Karl Marx was writing, when the tools of war and revolution were attrition. But we've moved on since then. The tools of war are increasingly complex and technological. The modern bourgeoisie is the modern state and the economic elite who have access to intense amounts of weaponry and abilities to defend and protect their private property that you never gave us a reason why they would just want to give up. We think that means that your capacity to actually achieve your revolution is limited. Bo accepted this when he said it would only succeed in some instances. Yes, closing.
You claim that in the end it can be beneficial because capitalism means people become richer. If the Chinese worker was paid more than $3 a day, isn't it fairly likely that they will be replaced by some kind of mechanized workforce?
Isn't it likely to be replaced by some sort of mechanized workforce? Yes, but at that point when you create technological workforces, there are still people designing that technology, there are still people implementing that technology, and the capacity of those people to be like Chinese is greater when they have some money and can spend it on things like education. We don't think without this revolution we're destined to a world where everyone is unemployed. Finally, even if you get this implementation, why do we think it's still disastrous? We think your Marxist state is likely to be an economically depressed one because your incentives to work are gone, when the enterprises are all run by the state and there's no competition, when your capacity to live is exactly the same with or without you as an individual working in that workforce because you make such a marginal contribution to that economy. That leads to a stagnated and poorer state. And the most likely scenario is an incomplete revolution, which means you have poor states next to rich states in their world, which means that they are likely to be screwed and continue to be screwed by those same capitalist structures. And those communist states are going to be the ones that live in the developing world, which means they don't have the capital now to exist on their own, and there is no reason for Western liberal actors to inject capital into those markets. They had to show why this revolution would work in order to justify it in the first place. It definitely wouldn't. We oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech and would like to invite our Deputy Prime Minister.
Sorry, this will take a second. Panel, ladies and gentlemen. At Opening Government, we say there's a spectre that haunts the landed gentry, and that spectre is the freedom of the poor who have been systemically excluded from the society that we all should have a right to call our own. Earlier this year in South Africa, a bunch of students, tired of the figure of roads looming over their university, decided, enough is enough, and they said they're going to get rid of this. That led to a movement for the requirement and the request of higher education, to which the government said, we simply do not have the money. What they did is they stormed Parliament and said, you will make it a mandatory requirement because our parents fought for the liberty that we were denied by the apartheid regime. This is precisely the sort of thing we're standing for at Opening Government. The suggestion that it won't work is absolutely absurd. A number of things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the principle and the feeble response we heard, and then I'm going to talk about pragmatic benefits, right? But before which, I just want to start with two things. One, I want you to ask yourself about a human life. It's such a precious thing, and we only have about 80 years in this world, if at all, when you're lucky. 40 of those years are actually useful. And we spend those years working 9-to-5 jobs, which all of us hate, right? Just to get like $60,000 if you're very, very lucky at the very best, and you call that freedom. Bo and I reject that this is a realistic way to which individuals have a right to live their life. We think it's absurd that this is the extent to which we aspire to. We think that that was nonsensical and principally something we haven't heard a justification for. What did we hear in the previous speech? Quickly, a mechanistic quibble saying we can't work both within and without the system. Two things. Firstly, he misunderstood Bo. We're very happy to stand for violent mechanisms like this we saw with the Rhodes Must Fall movement within South Africa. These are literally students who were able to get the government to invest millions of dollars they had otherwise said they weren't and take that money out of private property by increasing taxes within that country. Secondly, we think it's totally consistent with it working within the system. Thinking abolishing certain property laws like intellectual property is the sort of thing we're standing for, so it can work both within and without the system. On the principle, I'm going to start by telling you just how violent private capital is. The vast majority of the people who are imprisoned in the world's prisons are imprisoned in virtue of crimes where they were trying to get something for themselves. So you were burglaring somebody or that sort of thing. The vast majority of these people are actually poor. So what they're striving for is the bare minimum required for sustenance. And in the developing world, the governments can't provide them with that. The state then, that is supposed to represent all of us, puts these prisons in cages, right? They put these people behind cages. We think that this is never at all justified, and this is the sort of system of enforcement that is required by private property. Secondly, wars of conquest for minerals in the vast majority of the circumstances, in the vast majority of the world, are justified on the principle that potential gain would actually justify this war. We think that this violence is the direct assault on human dignity that Bo was talking about. What did we hear in the previous speech? Firstly, and this is important because this is the extent of the principal argumentation we heard out of Opening Opposition. This is a principal debate. They said, in the instance that you fail, this amounts to sadism. The analogy was the extent of the argument. Panel, you have nothing else there on which to vote. Why is this problematic? Bo and I say self-defense, even when you're guaranteed to fail, is a justified thing to do. So I'm going to give you an example. In the at the end of the Holocaust, there was certain individuals in a Polish ghetto, and they knew that the German assaulters were coming to get them. Those people had two options. They could just kind of concede and capitulate because all of them were going to die in any case, or they could pick up their arms and give it their best shot, right? Fight against the Luftwaffe as they did. We think they were justified in pursuing these means, even if it meant that they were going to fail, because the resistance of evil is a good in and of itself. We think that this is the principle we stand for on Opening Government. We've heard nothing of comparable sophistication in the previous speech. The second thing, which he said was a principal argument, but in fact it was just pragmatic arguments, was that these people aren't culpable. Firstly, ask yourself about how the process of the acquisition of private property occurred. It was slavery, it was the Industrial Revolution, it was the principle was actually taking people, plunder, taking people away from people. So we think that acquisition was unjustified. But secondly, they talked about people who want to buy a piece of bread and that sort of thing, and that we're going to take money away from them. We think their ability to imagine a world outside of the confines of property is severely constrained. The only extent to which that is an argument is if you buy the premise that the paradigm we need to operate under is one of private property. Pragmatic benefits. They had a number of things here. I'm going to start by telling you why, contextually, the state of affairs are getting worse for the global poor. The aggregate levels of absolute poverty poverty in Africa are worse today than they were in 1960s. Median wages of African American families approximate apartheid South Africa, and the trend is that they're decreasing. The 1% continue to own more and more wealth in society. Why was this? And Bo gave you like 5 pieces of material that weren't responded to, but principally they said 2 things. One, capital in all instances seeks to exclude, and secondly, it seeks to self-propagate. He gave you 5 reasons why we can't change it from within the system. He told you about where people live. He told you about the media, the collective action problem, disenfranchisement, and the international system that protects private property. To this, all we heard was that unions and democracy will solve. Panel, look at what they're saying in terms of argumentation and compared to the sophistication you heard in Bo's speech. The second thing they wanted to have then was they were talking about, they wanted to bring up the example of Asia. 2 sorts of responses here, the Asian tigers. Firstly, we say state-owned capital in many of those circumstances approximates on a balance closer to what we're talking about than what they're talking about. There's instances like Singapore, China, while aren't ideal, they're getting closer to the sort of ideal we want. Closing, I really encourage you to ask me a question.
You honestly think that Singapore more closely approximates Marxist Russia than it does Western liberal democracy?
Literally, this is our point. This is our point. This is our point. Our point was this. Our point is this. Yes, the state is acting in a capitalist manner, but the ownership of that is based on a democratic principle which everybody has the potential to benefit from. Yes, it exists under capitalism, but it's an approximation that we think is a step in the right direction, right? The bourgeois element before we get to Marxist utopia. Okay, on Asia, right? The second thing to say is that we don't think this is freedom at all. When people are dying and burning factories in Bangladesh and they don't have the political enfranchisement to say, hey, this is unacceptable to their government, we don't think democratic representation is something that is at all beneficial. What did we give you then in addition to this? Firstly, we told you they can succeed, and this is contrary to their arguments about them having better guns. 3 sorts of things. Firstly, the soldiers who man those armies, we think in very many circumstances are the global poor. The vast majority of the draft in the United States happens to be African Americans who have systemically been prejudiced by that government. Secondly, we think that just in virtue of the number of people who are actually poor, if all of them decided tomorrow that to follow opening government, Harvard on their way to success, we think would be very successful. Secondly, we think the resources happen to be in the places where very poor, and capital requires labor for it to be effective. Panel, there's a principle here and an assault on human dignity. Even if we fail, self-defense is justified. Incredibly proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and I'd like to invite our Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Opening government were a lot like the movie 300. There was a great leader, he gave a speech about fighting evil, and then everyone died. That's really the result of what's going to happen here, and I encourage you all to think a little bit more about that before we go any further. Because the problem they identified was the West holds global capital, holds global power, and in those societies, they're probably not likely to use internal mechanisms to give it up. If their policy succeeds, half of Asia becomes communist, doesn't have any money. What then? Here's the problem. At the point where structural imbalance exists, a Marxist revolution at this point doesn't change that structural imbalance. All it does is condemn millions, billions of people to living in that structural disadvantage. We prefer the status quo. We prefer property. 3 things I'll talk about. First, why this is an unfair pursuit of the policy that they talked about. I would encourage you all here to review your notes and get past the bluster of opening government, because what they were essentially proposing was a policy that removed the basic agency of all, that told people this is the job that you should do, you should accept it, because you should accept over and above any other ideology, the revolutionary consciousness within you. It denied people the ability to seek other ideologies like religion, like family, because your basic leader, your basic, the person you served was the state. And that was a global poor that, even if we can feel less sorry for everyone who is relatively richer, was imposing that on people without anyone's consent. An agency, by the way, that was the basic premise of our conception protection of human rights, our ability to be an agent in the individual and make choices that weren't subservient to someone, was a premise on which we built all other forms of development, all other forms of improving those people's lives. What did we hear in response? It was a bit confused. At PM, they didn't really want to use violent mechanisms. In Vanelle's speech, they just told us we're happy to, without giving us an actual justification of why that was the case. Tim gave you a couple of reasons. First is that it did matter what the result was, because this was a very, very high bar if you took up arms. You doomed people to death, you hurt people, you overthrew established norms that disrupted the daily peaceful lives of people. It did matter, therefore, what the substantive result of this policy would be. We also told you that as hard as it is to feel sorry for us all in this room, that perhaps when we think about the successful justified revolutions in the past, part of that includes an active dictator who maliciously hurts you. Somewhat in the West, people are distanced from this sort of suffering, and we're starting to improve that with the improvement of global media. Not necessarily everyone is aware of the impact that they have, and therefore they shouldn't necessarily are justified in violently trying to overthrow those people who have really done nothing wrong, done not that much wrong in a system that has broadly, brought them in. When they talk about slavery and those sorts of things, we don't think the amount of agency that the modern participant in the global society has in those sorts of historical policies justifies that sort of violence. But the point that we want to make here is this is a policy that robs people of their basic agency and does require somewhat of a success for them to be justified. It's not good enough for the pursuit of overthrowing evil if the result is destitution and death, Madam Speaker, I forgot, sorry. Second thing, why this won't succeed, and that's bad. The thing that I told you in my introduction is at this point, the West holds a lot of the power. That was the problem that they identified. They needed to fix that. First of all, they wanted to look to informal mechanisms. We're not likely to see much voting from people in the West because relatively they do hold power. Even if it's populations like the African-American population in the US, it's about relative power, according to them. That means that the only place where informal mechanisms would be even viable in leading to overthrowing capitalism and private property would be in the third world. My question is what then? What happens? Vietnam becomes a communist country and then says, cool, where's the money? That's what we need to do. And at that point, you're not able to engage. You don't welcome capitalist actors into your state if you're a Marxist state. You're not trading with Western corporations. You're not allowing them to skill your workforce. You're not allowing them to bring in capital and machinery that you don't at the moment have. The second thing is we told you to get buy-in. You actually need to deprive and starve people in the status quo to the point where they're happy to get up and rebel. That means that you're likely to give up incremental changes that are making a difference. They're making a difference in places like China. They're making a difference in Singapore. What was the response in the last 15 seconds of Deputy Prime Minister? The global poor will marshal. They number a higher degree, woefully unresponsive to the fact that Tim told you it's about weaponry, it's about capital. The West can go without the labor of the third world for 6 months a year, but the global poor can't go without the capital and food provisions that the West or rich actors in this debate provide us. Finally, Marxism will not succeed in the echo chamber that it exists in as a result of this successful revolution. There aren't work incentives for people to help each other. It suffers from the same human greed and same human problems that capitalism does too. The greed of getting social power, the greed of getting other sorts of power that doesn't necessarily accrue in capital. We think those are likely to be far worse. Before I go on, I'll take closing.
Around. The problem is the distribution of that, even in the third world, rather than the absolute amount available.
Cool. Well, we think that distribution is improved when you bring in, Western sources of technology, ability to distribute that better. And also, we just don't want people living on subsistence food. What we want is a greater degree of capital and a greater degree of wealth. Why is capitalism improving things at the moment? We told you and gave you factual examples about why that was changing. China, Singapore, India, they were, even if China and Singapore were relatively less, capitalists. They believed in private property. They had liberalized over the last 20 years. Like, don't even try to win those examples. When we're talking about intellectual property, you have things like generic drugs. And that's because you have an incentive to unlock the workforce in the third world, to gain a group of people that may be incredibly ingenious in how they innovate, in how they work, in how they mechanize. That's why India's had a huge booming IT industry that's come out of the fact that the West realized that there is a workforce there that they can tap into. Two responses. One was closing government about the mechanized workforce. If indeed, and that's probably true, that is the trend to which global economies and modern economies are going, it's important that we give people the amount of capital they need to then provide things like welfare within the context of a democratic state. If it is a mechanized workforce that we're heading to, the future is probably one that the state facilitates people's leisure time and allows the mechanized production to get the third world. We need to get capital to the third world for the third world governments to actually then provide welfare for their citizens. This debate may sound great from opening government, but unfortunately when we step out of this room and into the Marxist paradise that Beau imagined, we're all screwed.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and I'd like to call the member of government.
Just a brief reminder, I did not sign the consent to be streamed. If
speech, and I'd like to call our member of opposition.
Honorable Speaker, the poor of the world have two choices before them in this debate. The first is to engage in a revolution that will either fail or, more terrifyingly, succeed, or work within the system to improve their influence and their situation within the world, both domestically and internationally today. We will show you how the latter is significantly better. Okay, we're going to deal firstly with the principle of the debate. Because we get the principle that this is what you deserve, it's better to fight even if you are going to fail. Okay. It is principally deplorable to choose an option that will not only condemn millions of global poor to live in a post-revolution society where the people who control the economic and political levers of power are now prejudiced against them, but to subject the poor to economic, political, and violent destruction, right? We think that if you have two choices before you and you choose to endanger the lives of billions of the most endangered people in the world, that is principally abhorrent. So we're going to take it on that basis. No, thank you. Okay. Let's talk about what this revolution happened, or how this revolution looks when it fails. Because they admit that it will fail in almost all countries, right? We're probably talking like the United States, this is going to fail. Europe, this is going to fail. What are the harms of a failed Marxist revolution? It puts the interests of the poor diametrically opposed to the interests of the wealthy. This revolution threatens the property rights of the people who have power in society, political power, economic power. It threatens the lives that they have built for their family. It is based on a rhetoric that you don't deserve to have the things that you have, that you feel that you've worked your whole life to obtain, the generations of wealth that you want to pass on to your children. You threaten to take away everything from the people who have power. This will lead to a hatred, or at least an opposition to the poor. Secondly, what will this do to the rich? It will cause them to act in self-defense. So when Mikey talks about the biggest risk isn't that people lose some stuff. The biggest risk is that this revolution fails, and the people who have political power in the developing world turn against the poor domestically and internationally. What does this look like domestically? Look at how tenuous any welfare policy is in the United States currently, right? Look at how thin a margin Obamacare passed to give basic medical care to the poor in the United States. The reason that you got this kind of support is on a broad-based rhetoric that the poor deserve our help, right? That their interests are in line with ours, that they deserve help, and we can help them in this way, right? If you make it such that the poor are a threat to the landed elite, to the politically powerful, to the economically powerful in these countries, those policies will certainly fail. There will also be harms to any form for international support, right? Donations to the World Bank, to the United Nations Development Fund, those all depend on development will within the developed countries to give their money to help the poor. If the poor are set to take away everything that they work for and love, that is awful. Okay, so that's if it fails, why it's bad. I'll take front half.
On a debate about Marxism, you spent 10 seconds on the principle. Colonialism and slavery were themselves acts of war. Given that the capital was unjustly required, disenfranchisement requires reparations, and at best, property degrades dignity.
Okay, there's 15. Okay, look. The poor of the world, if they are made significantly worse off, if they are oppressed violently and economically and politically, will not take solace in your principled victory, right? We are fine to stand on practice here. Okay, next, let's talk about what if it succeeds, which is the real danger in this round, right? Where is it likely that this will succeed? In countries where there is a state that can be overthrown violently, in the places where the poor are the most vulnerable. First, Gov gets up and says Bangladeshi factories are currently very bad. Imagine if the country was thrown into a state of rebellion, what it would be like for these people, both economically and politically. Economically, all investment from the West in the developing world that suffer a violent Marxist revolution will immediately disappear, right? Given that the Marxist revolution will likely fail in where the capital is globally, people will withdraw and not have any jobs or investment in these countries, and it will lead to a huge period of economic instability that will take away the livelihood of literally millions of people. This is a serious harm. Next, it will lead to a complete shutdown of government, right? Who pays the police in this state where you have completely disarmed the government and removed them of any sort of legitimacy? Who oversees the electoral mechanism by which this new communist party is brought brought to power. They give you no reason to believe that a state that is violently converted to Marxism will be a utopia for the poor. In fact, we think that these states will likely lead to incredible perverse incentives for state capture. These kinds of revolutions are usually a very narrow military movement that do not have broad-based public support, right? There's usually one strong militant group in these countries that will take power under the guise of Marxism. Look at the massive Marxist revolutions in South America, and look at how they did not lead to a great redistributive state that helped the poor, right? But instead led to a concentrated military junta or government state that oppressed the poor and its opposition to maintain political power. It is perhaps the most dangerous to give these sorts of bodies absolute power over the developing world. It is a narrow movement that will not lead to better outcomes and will in fact disenfranchise the poor and destabilize states that need it the most. Okay, let's talk about our alternative, why it is better for people to work within the system. How can the poor make things better? We think that there have been huge steps forward in the international system, things like the World Bank, the WTO, and the United Nations. The United Nations gives literally tons of food aid, millions of tons of food aid to the entire world. And even the World Trade Organization is making huge steps forward. The recent agreement in Nigeria led to an agreement to reduce agricultural subsidies from the developed world to the developing world by 65% over the next 5 years. This is a huge economic win for the developed world. Why is this happening? Firstly, growing social awareness and vocal criticism of oppression of the West of the global poor in the developed world from scholars that come from Harvard that say this is bad and we shouldn't oppress people like this. Secondly, growing economic influence of these countries. Regional trade blocs like Mercosur, like the upcoming African Trade Union, are giving a more equal economic footing for the global poor to negotiate equal rights with the global powers, and this is improving their situation. Lastly, domestically, the poor in democratic countries, and even in countries like China that are less democratic, have a substantial ability to pressure their government to do things that are better for them, right? If you have a global poor that is able to unite for a Marxist revolution, clearly they can enact some sort of democratic change to give better policies for them within the countries. It is significantly better. We think that this is not a round about machines, right? Like the mechanization point, I'll spend the last 15 seconds dealing with. Mechanization is not what this round is about. This round is about economic destruction and political disparity for the developing world. We think that if you have principally the choice to lead to growth or deplorable destruction, that the latter is an unprincipled and unjust choice for the global poor. We are proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and I'd like to call our government whip.
Self-defense is not self-defense, and it is not justified unless you stand to lose, if you stand to lose more than you stand to gain. What we tell you in closing government is under the status quo, under a capitalist system, the vast majority of people, if not all, are currently unhappy. And if the worst which that side of the House wants to talk about is some level that you forego, some of systemic change of working within the system, that's irrelevant, because irrespective, they will still be unhappy, they will still be in a worse condition than they would when you have even the slightest probability of improvement. I want to talk about three things in this speech. Firstly, the principle. Secondly, whether it works. And thirdly, what are the potential alternatives. First, on the principle, we hear from closing opposition that we need to care about what happens to the worst of people within society. The premise here seems to be that under the status quo, under their version of the world, they will be in a better position. The first thing I want to note, it is unlikely the world of opening opposition, where people are starving, is likely to occur. In almost every country, if not every country, you have enough food and you have enough medicine, as we've been saying from the start of this debate. The question is instead how it is distributed, and that is something which we can improve on our side of the House. The question is instead then whether or not you forego more stuff if you don't have the capitalist system in place. But why is that stuff good? Why do you want more stuff? I think there's a couple things to note on this. Firstly, do you even end up with poor people doing well in places like China? That's why Joe dropped the ball when he talked about mechanization. Our point wasn't mechanization will occur and that's bad enough in and of itself. It's that someone in China or in the developing world cannot earn more than $3 a day because that's when capital has an incentive to replace that person with a machine and they become redundant. Opening opposition respond to that by saying, well, if you own the machine, you'll be doing fine. Yes, if you're the capitalist, you'll be doing fine, but we're talking about the worker here. But irrespective of that, we think even if you end up with more stuff, you don't feel happy. Michael explains this and we hear no responses to it. He talks about the feeling of inadequacy, which comes from the system where you identify yourself and you gain your self-conception through consumerism and what you are able to buy, which is often relative to others. How that is amplified by the media and the adverts which exist under the status quo and the lack of agency you have. One note on the lack of agency, which opening opposition seem to care so much about. I just want to highlight the reason why we intuitively think violence is bad is presumably because violence is when you subjugate your body to the wills of another individual. But under a capitalist system, the exact same thing occurs. You have to listen and do what someone else tells you, or you never have the money necessary to survive. That is equally violent, and why violence is justified under our side of the house. They say that violence from opening opposition must be targeted at the right group. Yes, that is a reason why government assets should be what you attack when you use systems of violence or corporate assets, not an argument against this per se. That is why that side of the house is simply wrong, because the risk-reward basis, if there is any probability of change, we win as long as you believe people's basic needs are met. What do we get from closing of this in terms of the probability of change? They say that you won't be successful because the rich will turn against the poor. I just want to draw an analogy here. One of the major reasons the civil rights movement in the United States was successful wasn't because of the kind of incremental steps they talk about. It's instead because the threat of violence was loomed over the ruling class, because of groups like the Black Panthers, which made more moderate groups seem moderate and a group you could actually engage with. Why is that relevant here? One of the reasons why you've had improvements in discourse over police brutality isn't just because of few incidents. It's because you saw violence in Ferguson. You saw violence in Baltimore. But why do people respond to it? Because that is a threat where you as a capitalist have your system of government under threat, the assets you have under threat, and your life potentially under threat. That is when you are far more likely to acquiesce to changes, moderate or otherwise, because you know the consequences for you for not doing so are ridiculously high. It isn't about empathy, as that side of the house wants to talk about, which is often piecemeal. Exact example of Obamacare, which still isn't implemented in many, many states with poor people. It's because that's piecemeal compared to what you actually get where threat is the motivating factor. But what happens in terms of actual change? I'll talk more about that after anything from opening. Yeah.
Capitalism doesn't want people to be illiterate because they can't grow the pie, and at the moment improvement is occurring through democracy and collectivized structures. Your Marxist state not only obliterates agency, but you haven't shown why those incentives exist to grow the pie under yours.
I mean, we've told you we don't care about growing the pie unless it is equal. That is the point of our case. So let's talk about what could actually happen. So the second thing they tell you is, well, what's the worst thing which could potentially happen? They say this revolution could succeed. I stand behind opening government, where very few of us could ever accurately describe what this system would look like, partly because the world we live in is so strongly structured by the capitalist expectations we have. I think it is worth noting it is quite likely any system will be democratic, but I think it's probably unlikely you'll get all-out success. But why can this measure actually work? For several reasons. One, because the problem's of the natural order. Many of us simply believe capitalism is natural. The fact that we believe the sun goes up and the sun goes down, because most people don't problematize every single aspect. Because this is structured and supported by myths. Myths like the American dream, which Michael points out, turns collective failure of a society into individual failure, which says the problems of the world are that of the poor's own failing. This is the system of false consciousness. Why does violence or a capitalist revolution, even led by a vanguard, as closing opposition seem to want, end up creating change? In the first place, because that's consciousness raising. You realize there are problems and people are willing to turn to violence to support it. You, as someone who is poor, who has always considered this to be natural and justified, now can at least problematize that. Secondly, because there's often transmission mechanisms. There were transmission mechanisms back in the Russian Revolution where you saw what was spreading from Russia into even parts of Germany and the United Kingdom. Similar things will happen at a greater scale now that we live in a world where you end up with more and more media. But thirdly, we think it is fairly important to realize that that you can end up with change. I don't think in most circumstances in the real world that change will be an entire collapse of the system. What it'll probably lead to is enough violence that you'll end up having to have some level of change, hopefully a reasonably large level of change on our side of the house. Redistribution and mass redistribution, probably more nationalization of the means of production, because the threat of you not doing so otherwise when you've created class consciousness, when you've created a threat of violence is significant. It's for all those reasons we're very happy to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and to close the debate, our opposition whip.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think it's very interesting that Harish says very few of us can accurately describe what this end state will look like. I think that points to how many of these movements have failed, which is why they don't want to describe the likely outcome of what happens in a Marxist revolution. The state looks nothing like the utopia that the government bench has tried to paint for you. It looks a lot closer to what Joe has described in our extension. I want to talk about three things in this speech: the principle of this debate, the process of arriving at a Marxist state, and the end outcome and which side is better on that. Let's begin with the principle. There's two main principles coming out of the government bench. The first is that private property is inherently unjust because competition is artificial, because private property is often unjustly acquired. There's two problems with this. First, this argument is ultimately hung on the end outcome of the state they're talking about, and here's why. Any sort of system of living together collectively in large states will impede upon the freedom of citizens. The question is, what kind of system best allows for those citizens to pursue the ends they want? At the point where Joe paints you a picture of a state which is susceptible to political capture and is unlikely to lend freedom to its citizens, the very fact that they own property does not mean that their broadened freedoms are more accurately respected. Second, even if the end outcome they talk about is desirable, at the point where the process of getting there is negligent, as Joe tells you, that is another reason to oppose the principle they put forward in this debate. The second principle they stand on is self-defense. They say this is akin to acting when your life is in danger. There are two problems with this argument. First, as Joe tells you and expands on in his extension, they greatly exaggerate the threat that the global poor face in a world that is increasingly sensitive to their needs and concerns. Opening opposition talks to you about the fact that some countries have liberalized and lifted people out of poverty as a result. Joe adds many things to this. He talks about the reorientation of international organizations into regional trade blocs that are increasingly sensitive to the needs of the global poor in the poorest parts of the world to mobilize and defend their own rights. He talks to you about the increased criticism of these organizations by academics and increased awareness on social media and other platforms of ways to improve them. But even if you don't buy that, this isn't analogous to self-defense for this reason. Self-defense is justified because the best case outcome of self-defense, living, is better than the status quo, which is likely death. Our extension is that the best case outcome of this policy, a Marxist state, is not better than the status quo. Ultimately, the degree to which you buy their self-defense point also depends on whether or not you think the state they create is better. No, thank you. Let's talk about the process of change. We've told you down the opposition bench this is unlikely to be a successful process. What have they told you in response? The first thing they tell you is that the military is largely comprised of people from lower socioeconomic groups. It is likely to be a successful military revolution. Closing government adds to this and say you create fear among upper classes for losing their wealth, which creates a need to acquiesce to demands. Two things to note here. First, the increased fact that militaries are based on sophisticated technology means that the governments we're talking about will have a very strong ability, Predator drones, tanks, etc. come to mind, to crush this revolution irrespective of manpower. Secondly, the demands you're asking of rich people are not ones they're likely to acquiesce to. You're asking for a radical reorganization of the whole state. This is an incredibly maximalist demand that they're unlikely to enter into a process of bartering or negotiation with. But thirdly, and this is the point that no one engages with on their side, Apparently in their world, if we're to buy the premise of their case at all, they have this incredible, unique opportunity where the entirety of the world's poor are willing to cooperate in Endeavor X. They want Endeavor X to be a Marxist revolution. But Joe tells you if you have this level of cooperation, exerting democratic pressure is a far more sensible way to achieve the changes you want to see. In fact, one might think that a broad-based movement that was advocating for change within the system would represent the example Harish thinks works for their side, namely the civil rights movement in the United States. I think the points they give you for advocating change are incredibly short-sighted. They then talk about mechanization. They say that the first thing to note is mechanization will radically change the way the poor work. It's locked them into earning $3 a day. Two responses. The unstable state Joe paints for you is one where people are denied jobs anyway because the state doesn't have the economic fundamentals or the political stability to allow for economic opportunity. Secondly, I would note that they're kind of hyperbolizing here. The problems they're talking about are some ways away in the future. I don't think revolutions are often based on the specter of threats that are going to arise like 50 to 100 to 150 years from now. But even if that was justified, the third theme of this debate of better outcomes is critical, and I want to talk about that now. I'll take opening.
How can you guys talk about agency and freedom when 10 million of the world's poor are in cages because of poverty? Are they not principally justified to violently attempt to free themselves, even if they fail? How will the WTO help them in that endeavor?
No, sorry. If you think, you can't say that they're going to be justified even if they fail, because the outcome is a world where their cage expands and more of them are put within it in a more oppressive system. I simply don't buy that this kind of try your best is going to work, especially when I've distinguished why self-defense is not an appropriate analogy in this case. Let's talk about better outcomes. The first outcome, attempt at an outcome from opening government is Finelli doesn't like the fact that we have to work from 9 to 5. Well, I don't think communist Russia was well known for its comfortable working hours or comfortable hours for laborers in general. And to speak more seriously, they're talking about people being structurally shut out of systems of power. This is the crux of the government case. People can't access the media. People can't access international organizations. People cannot access global capital. Firstly, for all the reasons Joe expands on to you about, this is getting better. The bar they would need to justify this kind of radical action is incredibly high, and improvements matter. But secondly, he paints for you a picture of political capture that is crucial. Opening opposition talks to you about the fact, briefly, that the economics of the state might be bankrupt. But the politics are far more pernicious. Tend to be led by narrow groups of people, and these revolutions tend to institute strong men like we've actually seen in South America. The resulting state does not lead to a utopia for the poor. It leads to the entrenchment of revolutionary leaders and the entrenchment of people who have an incentive to concentrate their own power at the risk of the people they are most concerned about in this debate. Closing government wants to talk about the American dream as an incredibly oppressive form of ideology that represents capitalism at its worst. Beyond the fact that this might be unique to exceptional countries like, not very good countries, like exceptional conditions like America, the important thing to note is, how have socialist countries traditionally gone about constructing ideology to get people to buy into the fact that these revolutionary leaders will institute equality? They institute far more pernicious systems of social control on their side of the house. They institute systems where political strongmen are able to retain power over vast swaths of the global poor, and on the comparative, remove their ability to democratically agitate for the changes that both sides of the house want to see. We beg to oppose.